between the US and China and how Korea would respond to it, because obviously this increasing conflicts will create kind of barrier to kind of settling to Korean Peninsula issue. And China is obviously, we have a conflict between Korea and China as well, like for instance, like that issue or cross-strait issue as well, whereas the US is still one of the major strategic assets to South Korea. So in this escalating conflict in this climate, what would be the response, I mean, in your opinion, what would be the Korea's response to it, and how are we gonna direct our policy direction, if that makes sense?
South Korean strategy vis-a-vis North Korea, specifically?
Yes.
Vis-a-vis how to deal with the North Korea problem in the context of US-China?
Yes.
Right, yeah. Yes, good question. It's very complex, of course, but one point I would underscore is sort of the implication. This presupposes my reading of Kim Jong-un is correct, which is definitely debatable. But if it's correct that one of his objectives, a preference that he would like, is to kind of get out from the armpit of China, get out from the economic dependency on China, the diplomatic, the geopolitical dependence on China, then that presents a huge opportunity to South Korea and the United States. That's the key though. I mean, South Korea, as the Moon government is trying to do, but it's not easy. South Korea has to work in a very coordinated fashion with the United States to lure that yearning by Kim Jong-un out, to convince him we really are ready, we, South Korea and the United States, as independent countries and as an alliance kind of structure, we are ready for a very different relationship with you, Kim Jong-un, and you, North Korea. And that manifests politically, that manifests in security terms, and it manifests economically. And it requires very bold moves, such as withdrawing a significant, not a complete, but a significant withdrawal of US either troops in South Korea or assets, something like that. I don't think it's an interesting test. I don't think the North Koreans care as much about that. The Chinese are the ones who really care about that. But if Kim Jong-un said, no, you gotta get THAAD out of here, you gotta get 5,000 troops out of here, even 10. And for now the Moon Jae-in government and Trump say, okay, we'll show you we're really ready for a new kind of relationship where we're not locked in this hostility. And now what are you going to do for us? That what are you going to do for us is of course going to have a denuclearization component to it, but South Korea and the United States have to get over the idea fixe that this is all just about denuclearization. And understand that for Kim Jong-un this is kind of shifting his country over, integrating into basically this other bloc and landing it somewhere in the middle. So if I were advising the Moon government, that would be sort of the strategy, working closely with the Americans to lure Kim Jong-un where he kind of wants to go. And that, of course, can appeal to the current American logic of we're competing against China, right? The fact that you're kind of moving one of the pieces over closer to you is in a bigger strategic competition where you're not just focusing on their nuclear capabilities. It should have positive effects on that as well, but you're looking at a bigger picture. You're picking up a country, you're moving it toward you, right? Then actually US-China competition is a positive, so long as North Korea is serious about kind of moving away from its bloc. So, I don't know who would dare to.
I thought what you said about President Trump, his mentality about I win and not win-win was very interesting. But I also wondered, given what you said about strategic competition, if the US looking at it from a long-term perspective, I wondered whether I win is truly possible in the long term, especially because the world is so interconnected these days, and the US potentially needs to cooperate with China in the long term to win-win. So I was curious to hear your views on that.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, again, there's sort of how Trump may see these things, and then how even his administration and kind of the American security and economic elite see them, and then how maybe the American public see them, which does ultimately get a vote. So it's hard to answer, but if I focus on Trump, because I think there's a major tension there. I think that the way Trump is approaching this is from a I win view, and I think he would disagree with your premise. I don't think he accepts your premise about interconnectedness. And if you look at the policies that are being implemented, it's not a secret. They are overtly, even violently, hostile to interconnectedness. It's about building a wall. He ran a campaign on let's build a wall. It is about closing down the flow of people to the United States. It is a kind of withdrawal, back into the United States. And what are other countries supposed to do? They're supposed to come, if you want to do business with the United States, great. Okay, that's a win-win. You move your company to the United States, build your Volvos, give jobs to people in Arkansas, and we'll buy your Volvos. But you come to us. We're not going to you anymore. So, like the ambassador's description of internationalism and the Swedish consensus around internationalism, there's still internationalism in the United States. It's a much weaker consensus to begin with. And Trump is a very radical rejection of internationalism. And he enjoys a core support of at least a third of the voting population. Put him in office and is ready to vote for him again, from everything we can tell. So for him, it's a false contradiction. Actually, this whole liberal, interconnected, global order, it's great for everyone, win-win, that's the problem. Believing that is the problem. It was that false belief that led America down a dead end, especially with regard to China, of letting China into the WTO, letting Chinese goods flood the Walmart stores, letting the Chinese buy up American debt, right? One after the other, the United States interconnected too much with China. China benefited extraordinarily from it, as we're seeing. The United States is actually suffering from it. So economic ills in the United States are blamed on precisely this. And the strategy is, the term you may have heard, decoupling. Decoupling, economic decoupling. So one of the most interesting things I think about the trade negotiation is, and this is where it's hard to read, it's still hard to read, but up until the collapse of the last set of negotiations in Washington, most people thought Trump is using tariffs as a source of leverage, to kind of punch at the other side as he worked out the details of a deal that will, and then the tariffs will go away and it's kind of back to normal. Maybe the Chinese have compromised on a couple issues, and so he can spin it as good. Maybe the Chinese negotiating team thought that was the case. Many Americans thought that was the case. Many businesses, markets thought that was the case. Now that those talks collapse, it could still be the case. But there's another school of thought that I find more and more persuasive in describing the things I'm seeing, which is, no, it was never heading toward a deal. The tariffs will continue. They will get bigger. And the end game, there's kind of a fake end game. They're not leveraged for a big deal. They are a way to force a separation of the US economy and the Chinese economy. Just like you try to build a wall to keep migrants out from Central America. It's quite coherent if you think about it with Trump's message. And so that's I win. And win-win was the big mistake. That kind of liberal internationalist win-win mentality is what got America into all these troubles. That Trump ran his campaign on the anger over those and the resentments in the United States over those issues.
You mentioned this Thucydides trap about the power transition between hegemons, and you agreed that we are kind of in the red zone right now. But there's also a consensus that the Thucydides trap is not going to happen this time because of the economic interconnectedness of the countries. But I want to ask a slightly different question. What is the effect of the nuclear capacity of the two hegemons this time in making this Thucydides trap not happen? Because in the history, the two hegemons have never had nuclear weapons before. So do you think that's also an important factor why the history will not repeat itself this time, or is that negligible?
It's a great question. I don't agree with the first part, that there's a consensus that the economic interdependence between the US and China, solves the Thucydides trap dilemma. And you can look at a case, there's a clear historical case of the US-Japan relationship, where actually the US and Japanese economy were pretty deeply integrated right up until 1941. And it was when the United States started a process of decoupling, essentially, and separating that relationship, that Japan began its really serious war plans that then manifested with the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, and that brought the United States in World War II. So that's often presented as a counterexample of we cannot bank on this trade relationship, right? Let alone if this is real and they're moving toward decoupling, we start to see the trade volumes getting smaller and smaller between the US and China. Then you've really lost, insofar as it's a shock absorber, it's gone. So that may have been, I just want to clarify that issue. I don't think that consensus is too solid. And I'd like to hear the ambassador's view, because he's the expert on arms control. In terms of, again, the question of has this ever happened before, I didn't talk about the US-USSR relationship. There is a lot of discussion of Cold War, new Cold War. I was at a workshop a couple weeks ago, a US-China workshop, and I would say there's more of that on the Chinese side. This is a new Cold War. But I think it's like this week's Economist. I don't know if we have Economist fans out there. The cover of the Economist is like new Cold War, right? Between the US and China. So the Cold War is the quintessential case of two nuclear-armed superpowers, not great powers, but superpowers, who have the capacity to destroy themselves and probably life on Earth, or a pleasant life on Earth. And of course the whole logic of the Cold War, which retrospectively by most of our scholars is seen as like a good thing, was that mutually assured destruction prevented war. The reason that doesn't comfort me too much, and there's one book I would suggest that I think demonstrates this, a recent book by historian Paul Chamberlain, that's a history of the Cold War, but it focuses actually on East Asia. It focuses on the period, I said from 1979 afterward, you have the East Asian peace. But up until 1979, you have massive scale of war. The Korean War, the Chinese Civil War, the Korean War, the Indochina Wars, multiple wars in Vietnam, then wars within Southeast Asia. And then, then the war spreads across basically to the Middle East. And that's really the beginning of what we know of a region of unable to escape from these cycles of war is from the 1970s. That's all part of the Cold War. And in many of those conflicts, and the point of this book by Chamberlain is, these are superpower conflicts. The US and the USSR are backing, politically and militarily, the two sides in all of these conflicts. But they don't count as Cold Wars because it's not American soldiers and Russian soldiers shooting at each other. It's not Russian territory and American territory suffering the destruction. Therefore, you can say, oh, no, the Cold War worked. No one was hurt. Right? But he counts up tens of millions of people who died in Cold War struggles. Nothing cold about it at all. Right? So that would be, again, a worrisome counterexample of ways in which the United States and China can be like the US and USSR, nuclear armed. They have this capacity for total destruction, so they're not going to go there. But there are many things they can do that are military conflict that result in devastation short of using those weapons. And the fact that they both have those nuclear arsenals, it might prevent them from a direct war against one another's territory, but it doesn't mean it will prevent them from fighting or supporting conflict in other parts of the region.